In this episode of Narrative Theory, we're going to provide an introduction to characters from a narrative and structural standpoint. Then, as we get to that central topic, we'll begin to weave a web that stretches out to other parts of narrative and eventually reaches the far ends of speculation, as we do in each episode. But, to get right to the core, let's get started. Introduction to characters. The first thing we need to know about characters is that they have a component of story structure and a component of storytelling. Imagine two twins, for example, identical in their DNA. That would be the equivalent of story structure. Each one might be a protagonist, or each one might be an antagonist, but they're structurally the same. They provide the same function within the story. Okay. But by the time you give them their individual experiences, they develop their own personalities. They wear different kinds of clothes, perhaps. Sometimes they try to look alike, but in fact, anything that makes them unique, anything that makes them different from being simply another identical body to the other twin, that's the storytelling part. So, how many protagonists do you know? Every single protagonist is identical in terms of their archetypal function within a structure. All that makes them different from one to another is the storytelling, the trappings you put on them, their personas, their personalities, the way they present themselves, the subject matter that deals with them. Subject matter has nothing to do with structure. Subject matter is simply where the structure is found. So, if you say 1 + 1 is 2, that's true whether you are dealing with it in old-time West, or whether you're dealing with it in science fiction. 1 + 1 is 2, unless you establish that the laws of mathematics don't work. So, just conceptually for us, structure is that underlying skeleton, the DNA of your story, and all the things that makes it interesting and unique, and one character different from another. All that's the storytelling. So we're going to be focusing on just the structural aspects of characters today. We're going to talk about archetypes, complex characters. We're going to talk about the fact that characters have two jobs to do. In fact, let's start with that. Characters have two jobs to do. One of them, they need to fulfill their function, whatever it is, within the story's structure, the argument of the story that eventually creates the meaning of the story. And two, they also have to be individuals, real people, that the audience or reader can identify with and say, yeah, I know that kind of guy, or I understand that person as a real person in the real world, represented in the book or on screen. And yet they still have a function, like a protagonist or an antagonist. All right, so that's where we're going to come from, is there's these two different things. And why are there two different things? Let's take a little aside for that. From a narrative theory standpoint, we're talking about the fact that each individual has within themselves certain traits, like they have, for example, their ability to reason. They have their passion, their emotion. So we've got those two aspects of every human being that ever was. Unless you got brain damage, which would make you a non-functional or dysfunctional structure, you have a sense of reason and a sense of passion. You've got a conscience and a temptation. Sociopaths are broken in some way. They're a broken structure if they don't really have any kind of balance between conscience and temptation. You also can look at our self-confidence and our self-doubt when we're approaching something as well. And when you put all these different aspects together in a little list, it turns out that structurally, those are the archetypes. Everything else that isn't contained in those basic human qualities that we all possess to help us solve problems, improve our lives, anticipate things that are going to be coming down the pike, and dealing with trying to come to terms with things that already have, those qualities that we all share and all possess and all use for those things, those are the archetypes. But there's a difference between the archetypes and the stereotypes. For example, if you have a guy who's a rough and tumble bush pilot, well, there's no structure there at all. There's no archetype there at all. A rough and tumble bush pilot could be an antagonist, a protagonist, a character who represents conscience or temptation or our skepticism or our confidence and belief and faith, okay? Faith and skepticism. Okay, these are the structural components, and just knowing that somebody's a rough and tumble bush pilot, no matter how much you write about him, unless you know what a structural component is, you haven't built a structure for your story, or you haven't found the structure in the real world that you're trying to analyze. So, archetypes are those basic structural roles of which we're kind of loosely familiar in general. And stereotypes are the typical personalities we assign to those roles. For example, a protagonist is often a hero or an anti-hero. And you have an antagonist who's often a bad guy. But if you look at the structural component of a protagonist and an antagonist, what do they mean structurally as opposed to the way we commonly use them in stereotypes? Structurally, a protagonist means the drive to try and achieve the goal. An antagonist is the drive to prevent that goal from being achieved. That's what the structural component is. And where does it come from? From ourselves. Protagonist represents our motivation, our get up and go, our initiative is a way to look at it. And the reticence to change, the desire to let sleeping dogs lie or keep things the way they are, prevent that goal from being achieved, prevent the current order from being upset. That's the job of the antagonist. And those two forces are within us all the time. One hand, the other hand. Conscience and temptation, skepticism and faith, self-confidence, self-doubt, and our initiative and our reticence. I'm not going to try to make an argument to convince you of that. But as I said, each time we do one of these talks, we're going to hit the core and then move out like I've been doing to show how it affects other things and how other things affect it. And episode by episode, you begin to get a layering effect. That's how you study something like Zen. You can't get into those Eastern philosophies just all at once. You have to go through the process to get there. That's why first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Ultimately, you grow by overlaying all the contexts surrounding the topic. Now, okay, so if we understand characters, it's interesting there are actually two types of characters and structure. So we talked about there's storytelling stereotypes or personalities or anything, even if it's not a stereotype and a wholly originally unique character, that's still storytelling aside from the component of what they do in the story. And so far we've only talked about archetypes. I mentioned there would be complex characters, archetypes like protagonist, antagonist, reason, emotion, things like that. Okay, but even within characters, there's not just archetypes. And here's why. We all have within ourselves these things that we use to solve our personal problems. But when we come together in a group towards a common purpose, we automatically self-organize into a group mind. Basically, a big mind structure in which someone will emerge as the voice of reason. Someone will emerge as the speaker of the passion or humanity. Someone will be the resident skeptic and the one who always has faith. Yeah, we're going to do it. It's totally doable. Okay, these archetypes become represented by virtue of us organizing. People specialize in those areas where individuals are mostly drawn, so that people enjoy being the voice of reason or enjoy being the skeptic, and so they gravitate towards it. And what happens in large groups? Well, if two people want that job, they duke it out, and eventually there's a pecking order established where here's the skepticism group, here's the faith group, and they often form departments within a company. They often form different subgroups within any kind of an organization, whether they're terrorists or whether they're a political party. Sometimes those two things can be the same. In any event, we form these group minds. That's also what happens with corporations. You end up with, like Apple Computer, there's people who are fans of a particular television show. All of us tend to belong to a whole slew of different group minds, whether it's the group mind of our family, we're the Millers, or whether it's the group mind of science fiction fans, or the group mind of one political party or another. There is a certain essence to that group mind that we identify with as part of. We feel that we are within it and contained within it, and also contribute to it so that it comes from us and it also helps define us in this particular context. So that, you're not necessarily going to be the father when you go into the office and have to talk to your boss. That's a different group mind. Okay? So when we form a group mind, then we have two roles, like we talked about characters before. And this is the real world. One of them is we must be true to ourselves with our own problems that we're dealing with that nobody else is particularly concerned with necessarily. We're trying to make the bills, we're trying to deal with a bad health report, we're trying to figure out what to do with our lives. Those are personal issues. But when it comes to being there with everybody else in the group mind, then we have to be concerned with what the goals are of that mind as a whole, and we play a role in that. So when we play that role in the group mind, that's where we are the archetype or a complex character. We'll get to those later. But when we are dealing with our own issues, we're individuals. That's where all dramatic tension comes from in a story. We pick somebody and say, this guy's the main character. This is the one we want to stand in his or her shoes, experience what they experience, to care about them, to root for them, to hope it turns out right, to hope they make the right decisions. And we empathize or sympathize. Empathize if it's written in such a way for us to stand in their shoes, and sympathize if it's designed for us to stand over their shoulder and care about them as the primary subject of our concern. Okay, that is the character, the main character, who is the heart of the story. And in the group mind, the main character represents our sense of self. Just like we think, therefore we are. We have a sense of who we are. That is the function of the main character in a structure, a narrative structure, whether it's a real-world group mind or a story. You end up with a main character who represents that I think, therefore I am. This is the conscious mind, the considering mind of the structure. All right. All dramatic tension in stories and all problems in life generally come from the dissonance, the differential between the needs and demands of the group mind with which we are involved, to which we are committed, and also our individual needs and problems that we're trying to solve. When the two come into conflict, that's what creates dramatic tension in the real world, in fiction. And it's only when those two things are resolved. For example, when Scrooge resolves the way he wants to look at the world with the situation in the world that he's faced, the group mind of the story as a whole, all the forces that are in there that he sees, past, present, future, Marley, all of this comes in, Tiny Tim, it has an effect, it's his world, and he says, I, from my experience, think that I should deal with Christmas and with giving and with being generous and all that this way. They're in conflict, and the story's drama is only resolved when one of the two is going to change. Characters don't have to change to grow. Characters can grow in their resolve. So if you look at the old movie The Fugitive with Dr. Richard Kimball, played by Harrison Ford, sought after by Tommy Lee Jones, who's trying to track him down. He's wrongly accused of murder. And Dr. Richard Kimball, Harrison Ford, he never gives up his belief that he is innocent and can prove it. And he spends the whole story going out to try and prove his innocence. And in the end, even though all the evidence had previously been presented and he was convicted solidly in court, he's able to overturn enough evidence that the real culprit is found, he is exonerated, and the world changes around him. We all look at that in terms of the stalwart hero, the hero who's not going to be tempted to go off the path. But stories are really about whether you're going to step off thinking it's the right thing, or you're going to stay on thinking it's the right thing, because there's another character besides the main character in the story. Totally different than archetypes, protagonist, antagonist, that's what they do. But grappling with this personal problem, there's the main character, and then there's their counterpoint. There's always a counterpoint. Always a counterpoint in stories and in the real world. The counterpoint is the influence character. Now, if you have a character as a main character and he or she has to reach a point of decision or is forced by circumstances to grapple with their beliefs, there's going to be another character, an influence character, who says, you're on the wrong path. For a moment, think about a story as a battle. Okay, there's the point of view of the general on the hill who's watching the battle, and they don't even know who the individuals are by name or personality. They just see this soldier hiding in the brush. They see this soldier leading the charge. They see this person on the other side of the hill waiting to engage in an ambush. If you zoom down into that story and you stand in the shoes of one of the soldiers, trying to get through all of these dramatic explosions going on in their life. Not literal explosions, but explosions of passion and hurt and worry. As they're trying to get through that, they select the path based on their experience that's the best way to go. And as they go down this path, through all the smoke of these dramatic explosions, a character emerges who says, "Get off the path, you're going the wrong way." The main character says, "No, everything I know tells me to go this way," kind of like Scrooge. "No, get off the path," says Marley, goes to Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future. They're all saying, "Get off the path." And you say, no, that's against my experience. I've never seen anything to lead me to want to do that. And you don't know, as a main character, if that fuzzy character that you can see through the fog of war, if that character is a friend trying to prevent you from walking into an ambush, or if they are an enemy trying to get you to step into an ambush. You don't know. That's why stories end with a leap of faith in general. Now, we'll talk about leap of faith in another one. There are some different kinds of leap of faith where it's a binary thing, another word, a gradual thing, and then a jump back. There's all kinds of different patterns, and we'll talk about them later. Be aware they're there. But when you reach a point of a leap of faith, Scrooge has to finally decide, am I going to keep on going as I was or change? And why does he do that? Because there's a balance established between all of his recent experiences and all of his past experience. And they reach a point where he doesn't really know necessarily which is the right way to go. You've seen this in movies over and over again, even with action heroes. There's a point where, should I still put down the gun, or should I hold the gun and try to shoot the guy who's holding the hostage through the head? Last time it worked this way, and maybe that was good, maybe it was bad. Will this time be the same? I don't know. And so you have to make that choice at the end, which way you're going to go. That's what brings it to you. But I want to wrap this up before it gets too terribly long, and this episode of Introduction of Characters, just by naming again those characters we have. We have the archetypes who represent functions, just like problem-solving functions or functions by which we anticipate a better world than the good one we've already got. It doesn't have to be a problem. So we've got archetypes like protagonist, antagonist, reason, emotion, skepticism, faith, self-confidence, and self-doubt. We'll explain why those are the basic archetypes and how they differ from other ones like the wise woman archetype or the trickster. Those all contain elements of storytelling which makes them stereotypes, not archetypes. So we've got the archetypal characters, and we can mix and match their components to make complex characters, or even more simple characters, by just taking one component out of an archetype and having the character represent that particular aspect of a small element of human experience. So we've got the archetypes, and then we've got the main character, and we've got the influence character. And the two of them go back and forth in essentially the philosophical or moral argument of the story until one of them will ultimately convince the other one to change their point of view. If the main character remains steadfast and continues on his path, maybe that'll lead to success, maybe not. That's the message of the story, whether it does or not. And the other one then, the influence character, will change. For example, in The Fugitive, Dr. Richard Kimball maintains himself, and Tommy Lee Jones, who had always been stalwart and said, this is just a job, I go and collect the guy, I catch him, I bring him back, it doesn't matter what I find out or whether I think he is guilty or not. He changes and makes an exception that allows Dr. Richard Kimball then to triumph in the end. But it was that stalwart nature of Kimball that made Tommy Lee Jones change. So one will change the other in the end. So, archetypes, main character and influence character, representative of our own lives, the archetypes within us, which are represented in the group mind as different roles that we play, and then the overall group mind's issues and whatever its central identity is represented by a character, like when Steve Jobs was heading up Apple, or the President of the United States, supposed to be the figurehead who represents us all, as this is the nature of this mind to which we belong. Okay, that's an awful lot. Like I said, introduction to characters, but later on we'll have a chart that you can look at and download one for yourself. Always check the description down below because I have lots of links to good things for writers that pertain to the specific talk and also other areas you may wish to explore. In any event, later on we'll give you some specific charts to do what the archetypes are made of, how they're represented, how they function with each other, the relationships they can have with one another, all kinds of good stuff. But I think that's enough for today. Certainly it's probably not the typical information. This is all based on the Dramatica Theory of Story that I co-created along with my friend Chris Huntley back in the early 90s and went on to be very successful and used by a lot of people. That's it. Until I see you next time in the next episode of Narrative Theory, may the muse be with you.